Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the podcast. It is a great privilege here to have Alex Manos on the show, a man that I've followed for the last number of years. He does a lot of amazing work around gut health, breathwork. He's a psychedelic guide, and he kind of specializes as well in resilience. And among many other things, he's quite a diverse individual. So I really look forward to having you on the podcast today, Alex, to share your wisdom and knowledge.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a rare opportunity to be on the other side of the microphone, so I'm going to enjoy it.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, great. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing all about the work that you do and put out there in the world. You know, you kind of focus in an area that I, have been really diving deeply into the last number of years, this kind of functional medicine, optimizing our human condition, taking care of ourselves on a deep, physiological, scientific, structural level. And then also, I've seen you've pivoted into the world of psychedelics and breath work and the mind too. And, I'm sure that, our health and our well-being is holistic. So yeah, that's what's really always struck me about your work is that, you're covering all the angles, which is really, really beautiful. So yeah, I'd love to really jump straight in and hear a little bit about yourself and what's your journey been like to get to where you are today.
Okay. So I guess to answer that, really, we go back to when I was a few months old.
I love it.
I had really terrible eczema when I was being breastfed. And I think as a result of that, really from day one, there was something that was just not quite right with my health. And I think people who are born with health issues, the way I sometimes think about it is we don't have a healthy baseline. Our body doesn't actually have that North Star of what it's trying to return to if we're experiencing dis-ease. And I think it can muddy the water a little bit. So from very early on, there are health issues. And then the next big thing, I was 5 years old in my first year at primary school, went to the toilet. And as you do at that age, often I sort of pulled my pants and shorts down by the ankles, went for a pee and had explosive diarrhea, ultimately. And I have this faint memory of kind of walking through school, loads of people seeing me in a pretty bad state. And my mum said from that day on, I just refused to go to the toilet at school. So as you can imagine, that sort of starts to develop into constipation and just issues with sort of bowel health and relationships. And eventually, when I was 18, I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, by the GP, and was told that I was just going to have to live with it ultimately for the rest of my life. And it just, as you can imagine, didn't really sit well with me. It really peaked when I was 18, sort of being in a fetal position, holding my tummy with just pain in the abdominal area. And it took me a while to, I guess, take it on myself and figure out what was going on. So after 18, went to university immediately after school, did the drinking, did the smoking, kind of just put up with having a dodgy stomach. And then when I was 22, I read a book on gut health by Patrick Holford, who founded the Institute of Optimum Nutrition. And I did that for 4 weeks alongside some gut-focused hypnotherapy. And in that 4-week period, every single symptom I experienced disappeared. And not just gut stuff. So not only was I now having easy to pass, well-formed stools, which for anyone who has experienced gut issues knows what a blessing it is to be able to have an easy poo. But also lower back pain from rugby injuries totally disappeared. And for the first time in 22 years or so, I slept through the night. I was falling asleep and staying asleep all the way until I was waking. And that was such a alien experience back then. So that kind of really got me on the track of nutritional therapy. I went and studied at ION, which is based in Richmond and London, to become a nutritional therapist, and sort of very much focused on gut health just because of my journey initially. And then I studied my master's in personalised nutrition, and at the same time studied with the Institute for Functional Medicine. So kind of really started to develop, I guess, a broader understanding of health and the human body. My master's dissertation was done in chronic fatigue syndrome. So I was working with a lot of people with CFS at the time. And that was kind of my 20s ultimately, a lot of studying, all in sort of the functional medicine, science, PubMeds realm, and loved it at the time. And I think I just got to my young 30s and there was just, I still don't really know how to describe it, a bit of a void. There was just like this, there's got to be something more than this ultimately. And I just think through my own personal experience in navigating life, I just thought there was something in me that I was aware of but couldn't tap into. And I have the terribly cliche story of I read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan.
Love
And
it.
Googled psychedelic retreats in the Netherlands, went to my first ever psychedelic ceremony. In that retreat was the first time I ever experienced breathwork, conscious connected breathwork, and was just obviously blown away by both, but in some ways more blown away by the breathwork because I just had no idea at all the power and how it can kind of crack you open. So post that retreat, I started training in transformational breathwork. I then found out that Synthesis, I went to the Synthesis retreat, found out they were sort of setting up their institute to train psychedelic practitioners, then jumped on the opportunity. And I think after that retreat, my vision was always to try and integrate, let's call it the science and the spiritual, to support clients, because over the years, so many of my clients struggling with whatever health issue it is, there's always a degree of stress/trauma and emotional stuff that feels like a really big driver of some of their condition. And I just didn't have the tools or the skill set to be able to help them in that area. And I guess the experience of the Synthesis retreat was just that this is a really powerful tool and could be helpful for a lot of people dealing with chronic health issues. And obviously we've got a little bit more research over the last few years around how psychedelics can have a really valuable role to play within certain conditions as well. So yeah, that's kind of my story, I guess, in a nutshell.
Wow, amazing. It kind of sounds like you're an academic at heart, similar to myself. It's like once you see the target, it's like, wow, I'm all in, I'm going for it. I want to learn everything about it,
Yeah. And I must admit, I've really struggled in the last few years, like balancing it all. Like I get pulled back into PubMed at times. Then I'm like, no, this isn't it. They get pulled back into just, let's call it energy medicine and just breath work and what we can, I guess, learn from those altered states of consciousness that you're just not going to find in a PubMed article ultimately.
Yeah.
So yeah, I still to this day really struggle balancing it all. And I sometimes wonder, how can I get there to a point where I feel I'm sitting in the middle of all of it and can hold both sides?
Yeah, absolutely. All of these kind of areas, where do they intersect? You know what I mean? From the the Western medical model, Eastern wisdom, indigenous wisdom. Where do they all kind of, like a Venn diagram, overlap, and where's this kind of optimal area that we can work from? There's so much in there, and I just find it so beautiful to hear that how you kind of from a young age took your life back into your own hands. You know what I mean? Like you were kind of given a deal of cards, and a lot of people just kind of like live with it, they get on with it, they manage it. But to me, you really wanted to get in there and get to the root cause and try and understand it on a deeper level.
Yeah.
And I see that with a lot of people that it gets to a certain point in their life where they only create change through deep suffering,
Right.
or breakup or grief or something like that. But what was the catalyst for you to really start to take charge and put yourself on a life direction almost?
Yeah, I think I'd always had an interest to some degree in health. I was an athlete at school, really, really loved my sport. And from 15 years old, just had this series of injuries that I never got back from ultimately. I haven't sprinted 100% flat out since I was 15 years old, just now from fear of, tearing my hamstring for about the 12th time. And I genuinely believe there was a really deep connection between the issues I was having with my guts and the systemic inflammation that was driving, and then like musculoskeletal injuries as an adolescent ultimately. So I think some of it stems from quite a deep sense of loss. Like I lost some key years that I could have been in my secondary school playing sport at a good level, and having that experience.
Yeah, sports regrets. Same as
Yeah.
me, never making national teams. If only I had trained harder.
Yeah. So there's definitely that, and like I've really felt that at times, like the grief ultimately of a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And I was really lucky from literally 14 years old. I knew I was going to be a personal trainer. And I was a personal trainer for a decade within that sort of journey in my 20s. So there was always that interest in the human body. And I think the physical side was just a number of physiotherapists and osteopaths and massage therapists I saw to try and get my body back on track, as it were. That kind of really drove my interest in it. And then I think coming out of university, having the experience of, such a profound shift in my health. And I guess, I've always been someone that wants to help others, like a bit of a people pleaser as well. I'm aware of that within myself. So I think there's kind of that natural fit in wanting to step into a role as some kind of healer. I use that term very loosely.
Yeah.
And, nutrition, personal training, massage was the start of that for me ultimately.
Oh, amazing. There's kind of two avenues I'd love to go down. One is kind of around, definitely I want to explore a lot around gut health, because that's always been a big topic for me in my life and my family in general. Always having issues with gluten and, bloating and all of these kind of things. But first, maybe I'd love to talk a little bit about maybe personalized medicine, because this is a topic I touched on in when I studied genetics, where the idea was, you'll go in, you'll have your whole genome sequence. They'll tell you exactly, what proteins aren't being made, what proteins you need more of, all of this kind of stuff. How has that whole sphere evolved over the last number of years?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, this is probably an area that I sit on the fence around.
Yeah.
I think there's that balance to be had between the generic advice that is, true for all of us, that most of the population aren't doing. And that's one of the reasons we have a bit of a health crisis ultimately. And then, you've got this piece of hyper-personalized nutrition, supplementation, medicine that absolutely has a role. But, I guess if we were to envision a pyramid, it's obviously the cherry on the top, so to speak, when we come to the personalized side of things. So I do think that majority of people struggling with a health issue could do the same stuff and get some significant improvement in their health. And I think one of my concerns is, especially with social media and all of the information out there, a lot of people are jumping straight into the personalized medicine, personalized nutrition, and they don't have the framework, they don't have the groundwork in place to actually leverage that properly.
Mm-hmm.
And you can think about it from, if we look at the microbiome from this perspective, we know that we do have an individual response to foods. So if you and I were to have 25 grams of almonds every day for a few days, we're not going to have the same microbial response. So we might even have the same bacterial species. One of us might see an increase in that bacteria, and the other person might see a decline in that bacteria. So I think depending on the sort of the context and what you're looking at, it really matters. And again, there are companies that are really promoting this concept that we can look at your microbiome and tell you what foods you should be consuming based on that. And I do think the majority of people would say that's not strictly true. We're not there yet, ultimately. And because we've got so many studies showing what I've just kind of described in regards to that really individualized response that you cannot predict, ultimately. So I, at the moment, very much have probably moved out of the sort of the real personalized stuff, unless someone's at the point where they're trying to really optimize their health.
Yeah.
And really trying to focus on the foundations that, the majority of us aren't doing consistently if we're honest about it ultimately. And that could be anything from thinking about our light environment to thinking about our physical activity. You look at some of the statistics around how conditions have skyrocketed in the last decade or so, and you can bring this back to some real foundational stuff. So we're definitely evolving in regards to personalized medicine, and probably a good area of that is the circadian biology component, where we now know there are certain medications that are better taken at certain times of the day.
Oh, wow. I
And
didn't
there are
know that.
certain cancer treatments that are more effective at certain times of the day. So it's not an area that I'm deep in, but I do know that certainly from a cancer perspective, I think that's probably leading the way in regards to kind of circadian treatment and when we should be taking medications or chemotherapy and these kinds of things. So it's kind of like really exciting, but I don't think all of it is, at a point where it should be applied by you and I, the general public, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. Unless you're, like you said, optimizing and maybe injecting peptides into yourself for, that's fascinating about the kind of the circadian rhythms then in the body. Is that would that be to do with hormone level fluctuations, absorption rates,
I
that
think
kind of
so.
thing?
Yeah. I mean, everything's got that sort of circadian alignment. So if we think about it, you've got those clock genes. So the way it's often quite simply described is we've got that SCN in the brain, which is detecting the light, telling us what time of day it is. And the SCN is transmitting a message to all of our cells what time of day it is and telling the cells what they should be doing accordingly. So within that, we know that there is shifts in our microbiome over a 24-hour period. There's obviously shifts in immune cell activity and function over a 24-hour period. Everything is ultimately peaking and troughing throughout the day. And there is a paper that showed that the liver has the most circadian genes, suggesting that liver has a significant role to play within sort of circadian sort of activity, as it were, which makes sense when we think of when would the immune system be most active from like an evolutionary protective perspective, or when would we do more of our detoxification from a 24-hour perspective and things like this. And something was just on the tip of my tongue. Oh yeah, so from a supplement perspective, there is a paper looking at resveratrol, a really common antioxidant people supplement, showing that if you take it in the morning, it acts as an antioxidant, as you would expect. Take it in the afternoon, it acts as a pro-oxidant. So we are starting to see from a supplement perspective, there are kind of those optimal times that we should be taking it. So we're in this, I think, space where, we're moving away from the old narrative. We're not quite in the new narrative, and we're having to, try and stay up to date, I guess, with some of this research.
Wow, absolutely fascinating stuff. And then how does the kind of the role of the the gut microbiome really play in all this? Because I'm really fascinated about this kind of gut brain axis. That the gut is actually making most of our serotonin, and I think some of the research is kind of pointing towards people that suffer with depression, that maybe it's an issue with the gut more so than a brain issue, where the serotonin isn't being made to a certain quantity that helps regulate their brain neurochemistry.
So when we think of the gut-brain axis and really the gut microbiome, it's always important to appreciate that it's the metabolites that the bacteria are producing that are interacting with our own cells and then influencing systemic physiology. So definitely the most researched, most well-known and discussed metabolite is butyrate. So we have butyrate-producing bacteria. These are obviously bacteria that are producing this metabolite, and they do that when we feed them the right types of fibers, which includes resistant starch. And the most sort of effective resistant starch is what we call retrograded resistant starch. So we can find that in cooked and cooled potatoes and cooked and cooled rice. But resistant starch we'll find in some grains. We can find it in green bananas, amongst other foods as well. And butyrate is often talked about as the main fuel source for our colonocytes. So the colonocytes are some of the cells that line the colon, the large intestine. And as a result of this, butyrate, we could kind of say it helps prevent leaky gut from developing. And a lot of people now know about the concept of leaky gut and its role in various conditions. So there's even a paper that talks about how butyrate is the bread and butter of gut health. It has a real foundational role to play. Not only is it helping the integrity of the gut lining, but it's antimicrobial, so it's helping maintain a healthy microbiome. It helps with motility, so it helps get stuff through the gut ultimately. It has a role to play in as anti-pain properties. It helps the absorption of electrolytes, amongst other things. So it's really important for us to be producing good levels of butyrate. And as I say, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other metabolites that are all interacting with our own cells. But you can kind of think about these metabolites as the orchestra, maybe. You know, they really are controlling how different types of immune cells are functioning and how we're therefore going to be responding to other different organisms. So the microbiome absolutely is one of the foundational pieces when we think about sort of physical health. And, you know, trying to bring it all together, I guess, we now have papers that are starting to explore the microbiome from a psychedelic perspective as well. So, you know, that's bringing together two really exciting areas of science ultimately.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, how, the gut and its kind of function, and if it's, not fed with the right bacteria, causes so many issues for people, What are the kind of the most common kind of gut health issues you think people are facing at the moment, and how do you kind of approach this in your practice?
So from a symptom perspective, a lot of people are struggling with bloating and bowel irregularities. One of the most common things I hear in clinic is, Alex, I look 6 months pregnant. So bloating is a really big one. And then if we think from a condition perspective, they're all on the rise, ultimately. Inflammatory bowel disease and the different types like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. There's an increasing prevalence of these autoimmune inflammatory gut conditions. And then I think now it's 1 in 4 visits to the GP are related to digestive symptoms. So people struggling with irritable bowel syndrome, as it will be called, which will be things like bloating, pain, changes to sort of the formation and quality of the stool. So some of these kind of, I'll call them low-level symptoms. They can be incredibly debilitating, but there's no sort of obvious pathological change within the gut, even though we know that there is stuff like SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and leaky gut and infections that can contribute to these sort of symptoms. And then within that, I guess, there are a lot of people struggling with gut issues, but the gut issues are a symptom of a broader problem. That could be the most common thing I see in clinic will be related to mold illness and mycotoxins. So people that have lived in a water damaged property, been breathing in these metabolites of mold species that are growing in that water damaged property. And one of the consequences of that can be gut issues, basically.
Wow.
So I think one of the big mistakes that can be made really easily is we think we have a gut issue. So we're doing all the gut stuff. We're doing elimination diets. We're taking probiotics, prebiotics, etc. But actually our gut issues are secondary to something more holistic or more systemic going on within the body. And a really important thing to appreciate there's a paper that talks about how energy demanding it is to maintain a healthy microbiome. And they're talking from a mitochondrial perspective. So those that don't know, our mitochondria are often referred to as the powerhouses of the cell. It's where we create our energy. So if there is mitochondrial dysfunction, for whatever reason that may be, that can also manifest as intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut, but also dysbiosis that can contribute to things like the bloating and the abdominal pain that so many people are suffering with. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I'm actually really fascinated, by more out of fear, this kind of this issue with mold, because we live in these kind of damp climates, and a lot of Irish houses, a lot of probably British houses too, would have like these black mold, and how I understand it is these metabolites, they reduce this kind of probably ATP function in the mitochondria, and then this causes like chronic fatigue for people. And this kind of is that kind of how that would happen? Because I know when I first saw these TikTok videos, and I was like, oh my god, people are like, oh, black mold, it can rot your brain and create all this fatigue and gut issues. Is that kind of what the kind of science is showing now?
Yeah, so it's important to appreciate that, I guess, with the whole sort of mycotoxins, most of the research is still from an animal study research perspective. Like there is very little published research on humans. So a lot of what we know comes from either animal studies or just anecdotal, like practitioners that have been doing this for years with clients, and they know what they're seeing and what's working from a treatment perspective. But what we do see in the research, in what has been published, is mycotoxins have been associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. They've been associated with multiple sclerosis. In fact, some researchers have said mycotoxins might be the primary driver of multiple sclerosis. And then again, from an animal perspective, we definitely see that there is a strong link between mycotoxins and gut issues. But different mycotoxins have a different affinity for different bodily organs and systems. So some are quite kidney toxic, some are more liver toxic, some are more neurological toxic, some are gut toxic, etc. So depending on what mold you're exposed to and depending on what mycotoxins that mold produces will influence what condition you might end up with ultimately. But for no particular reason, it's just how it's unfolded. Like 90% of my clinic now is seeing clients who have a mold related illness ultimately. So this is people that they don't just have a positive mycotoxin test, because there's a lot of nuance in regards to this that we should probably touch on, but their timeline aligns with it, meaning they moved into this property, the property had mold issues, and they started to get sick having moved into the property, or they were in a property, there was a water leak, and then a few months afterwards they started to notice that they started to get sick. So there has to be a connection between different pieces of the puzzle. And what I mean by that is you could have a positive mycotoxin test and either be totally healthy, or those mycotoxins still aren't causing your health issues, because it's not just the toxin that's the problem, it's how your body is able to handle the toxin.
Yeah.
So the toxin's driving the oxidative stress or the inflammation, and the level of oxidative stress and inflammation is going to be dependent on your antioxidant systems, your nutrient status, your general inflammatory state, your immune system, etc., etc. So I think this is where, there's so much gray when it comes to this area of health. Like, it's definitely not black and white. And I actually find this a really interesting kind of piece of the therapeutic puzzle when working with clients. Like, do they need the black and white, or actually are they comfortable and able to sit in the gray of like, well, this could be contributing, but it's really hard to say with 100% certainty that this is, the protocol or the algorithm that we need to be going down.
It's kind of like these stresses of the environment. And I can imagine as well for people, it's not just home, it might be the workplace too.
Right.
And
yeah.
Yeah. And I've also seen, dehumidifiers are kind of, I don't know if the technology's getting better, or, people are buying them more to dry clothes and air out houses. So, I think that could be one way that people could probably, contribute to a better environment.
Definitely.
Yeah, one kind of other thing there that you kind of touched on a little bit was the kind of psychedelic research around changing the gut microbiome. What's the kind of update on that, and do you have any insight into how does taking psilocybin or I don't know LSD shift the gut microbiome?
Yeah, it's not something I've done a lot of reading around. I kind of skimmed a couple of papers that are on the topic. But the last one I read definitely was sort of theorizing, admittedly, but theorizing that we might be able to get to a point where we personalize the dose, for example, of, let's say, psilocybin based on mapping someone's microbiome. And there's definitely research discussing whether the microbiome is involved within the metabolism and therefore essentially the influence of the psychedelic as well. So I guess you can think about it from different perspectives. One is the actual metabolism of the medicine or the drug, whatever you want to call it. And the other one is how it actually influences the psychedelic experience. And then the third area of research that I've definitely seen is related to how does the psychedelic just influence the microbiome. So we know that psilocybin, for example, does have some anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties, it seems. So is one of the mechanisms by which psychedelics may support people with IBS, inflammatory bowel disease, actually related more to the mechanisms, let's call it the science of the medicine. So it's really interesting. It's obviously really, really early days. I know there's a study, I think, currently happening using psilocybin and assisted psychotherapy in irritable bowel syndrome. So that's obviously looking at, I guess, whether a high-dose psychedelic ceremony followed by actual psychotherapy can be helpful in people struggling with irritable bowel syndrome. And I've had a lot of people reach out to me on Instagram and sharing their stories. One of them really stood out, whereby this was a nutritional therapist. She had inflammatory bowel disease, and she was told that the only thing left for her was surgery to have part of her intestine removed. It was just that bad. She went into an ayahuasca ceremony, and ever since that ceremony has not had any gut issues and can eat anything she likes. Now, obviously, this is a really rare experience. I don't want to set people up and give people hope where, we need to be mindful this is not what usually happens. But I am fascinated by what can happen and trying to understand what is happening in those individuals. And sometimes, and this is one of those balance, I guess, Dara, where it's like there might be a sciencey explanation, and then there's just the beauty of, are we ever really going to know?
Yeah, the kind of magic and the mystery of it all, and
Yeah.
to be honest, I've also heard that too, with some psychedelics, people almost like resetting their gut. And it makes me wonder that, for example, ayahuasca is a very strong purgative, and I wonder if people are really like resetting their whole gut microbiome. And one of the kind of questions I was going to ask you as well is, are gut issues on the rise nowadays? Have humans always had like terrible gut issues? We're just aware of them more, or what's kind of contributing to the rise in gut issues? Is it like pesticides and herbicides, for example, or something like this? And maybe people who go to the Amazon and do a 10-week dieta, they're eating maybe local, organic, unprocessed food. 10 days, then their gut is reset, because they're not being hit with all this environmental Western, terribly processed and sprayed and this kind of food, does that kind of, what do you kind of think of that?
It's a good question. And I think, I have a bit of a boring answer, which is, it's a bit of everything.
Love it.
Ultimately, it is potentially the pesticides, herbicides. It is related to the fact that most of us are under too much stress and live really busy, fast nature lives. That is, you just cannot underestimate the role that stress and a dysfunctional, dysregulated nervous system plays within gut health. But, there's also a rise in the number of C-sections, for example. We know that's associated with it. There's a rise in the number of babies who are bottle-fed versus breastfed. So there's kind of the developmental, if we call it that, part of it. There's the typical diet that we're eating. There's our stress levels. We're more sedentary than we've ever been before, probably. We also live in a more sterile environment. So there's been this migration into urban environments, moving out of rural areas where there's farmland, etc. And we've got lots of research showing us that those living in rural environments have a more diverse microbiome than those living in urban environments.
Yeah.
And then there is just the general bad diet that from a population perspective, the majority are on. It's lacking fiber, it's lacking polyphenols, it's lacking key nutrients that the bacteria need to thrive ultimately. And then there's the circadian piece to it. There's a strong circadian alignment and circadian biology component to the gut microbiome. So it really is every area of our health and lifestyle, I think, that is impacting the microbiome and why there is this rise, not only gut issues, but, name a condition and there's probably been quite a scary increase in prevalence ultimately.
Yeah, it's like I think we're being kind of attacked and under pressure from so many different areas. Yeah, it's a hard one to get right, I think, for a lot of people. It can be quite overwhelming when you step into the space of wanting to heal your gut. Where do you what's the kind of the best advice, or where do you think people should start if they're like on a journey to heal their gut?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. What you've just touched on there, which is, we want to appreciate it's a marathon and not a sprint. And I think, and I've been there, so I totally get this, whereby we're just desperate to feel better. We want our life back, so to speak. And therefore with that desperation quite often comes a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of frustration. And I do think we can end up getting into a situation where actually we've created a barrier to healing, because, you know, we're rushing it, we're trying to force the healing process, and there's a desperation there and an energy there that just isn't conducive to healing. And then the second thing is, I do think if you've done the basic things, you know, if people Google healing the gut, they'll probably come across like the low FODMAP diet, for example. That's the most popular and most researched diet out there. They've probably tried some probiotics and maybe a prebiotic. Maybe they've tried an antimicrobial herb like oregano oil. Maybe they've kind of done a bit of breath work, or they're really working on their stress management. If they've done the basic things and they haven't really got the results they want, then I do think it's time to work with a practitioner who, you know, who's going to be able to look at things a bit more objectively, who's going to be able to guide you and collaborate with you and help you understand what might be the biggest fish in the pond driving your symptoms. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes testing can be really helpful. You know, doing something like a gut microbiome test to see, is there dysbiosis? Is there an infection that's driving this? Is there intestinal permeability and the other things that we can look for in some of those tests, which include, are you producing enough digestive enzymes from the pancreas to actually digest your food, for example? So sometimes testing can really help people identify the underlying imbalances that are driving it. But I think more often than that, it is just a lifestyle thing. And, you know, the nervous system has such a big role to play within the digestive system that a lot of us do need to focus on slowing down, you know, chewing our food, creating an environment that is essentially going to allow that digestive system to operate optimally, ultimately. So again, it's hard to say, but I always want to reinforce the importance of the foundations. So as another example, there was a case study published. I can't remember the journal, but it was basically, to cut a long story short, there was a female. She had lost something like 12 kilograms in weight because of the severity of her IBS. She didn't have IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. She just had, you know, what they might call a functional gut disorder, IBS. She was hospital bound because she had lost so much weight. She was in crippling pain. She was desperate not to have surgery. She was Googling everything, came across breathwork, started doing some diaphragmatic breathing practices, really started to regulate the nervous system. And the outcome was that she was able to resolve her IBS through breathwork, put simply. So again, for some of us, it is a dysregulated nervous system, which could be the result of, you know, all sorts of different things, but our overall environment and lifestyle are going to be big factors, as well as maybe there are some adverse childhood events in our upbringing that have kind of led to a nervous system becoming dysregulated in the first place. But I'm a huge believer in kind of the nervous system piece of gut health. And my dear colleague, Marek Doyle, does a really great job of kind of auditing his clients. And what he talks about is, you know, you need a relatively good heart rate variability score to have any chance of healing your gut. That's just like, it's a prerequisite to a good gut ultimately. So if you've got an Oura ring or a Whoop band, or if you've got an app on your phone that allows you to track your heart rate variability, that kind of gives you insight into obviously the vagus nerve and the nervous system, and whether actually you have the capacity to heal using sort of gut-specific interventions, the probiotics, the antimicrobials, etc. Or actually, is there some work you need to do before targeting the gut specifically that is, again, laying the foundations for these sorts of protocols to do what often they can do, which is help. So yeah, that's my thoughts, I guess.
Amazing. And you kind of covered like my next middle portion I wanted to segue into was the nervous system, you know, the nervous system and, you know, how it is influencing gut health, how it's influencing immunity. You know, there's so much research and practices coming out around the role of the vagus nerve in, you know, getting us from this fight or flight into rest and digest.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest kind of links there I see is the breath. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey with breath work and how it affects the nervous system, and maybe a little bit on our how it affects our immunity and how we deal with all the stuff in the body.
Yeah. So, I mean, the breath is just such a beautiful thing. It's something that we've got instant access to. Um, and it's something we can use in different ways throughout our day. There's some better breath workers than me who are able to talk about the breadth of breath work, whether that's kind of corrective breath work, if someone's got dysfunctional breathing patterns, moving to the other end of the spectrum where we've got our conscious connected breath work that can sort of facilitate some of those spiritual psychedelic like experiences that often we're doing on psychedelic retreats to prepare ultimately for the ceremony. And my journey was a really interesting one. So after the breathwork experience I had in the Netherlands on the psychedelic retreat, I went straight into a week-long sort of seminar, the initial training
Love that.
in transformational breath. And like I think is often the case, every breath session was amazing, but for me, it was this journey of being in my head, really thinking about the breath, becoming maybe a little bit more aware of how strong that inner critic was, for example. And it was the last session in that week where I kind of cracked open and just had this, beautiful emotional release that was related to my partner at the time, now my wife. Her dad committed suicide when she was 19. And I had a meeting, is the best way I can describe it, with him. And about 6 months before this week retreat, we had a miscarriage, and I met that spirit ultimately. And it was just this incredible experience that just left me in tears. And I can't remember the time before that I cried. It was probably when I was a drunk student and just on a night out at 2 a.m. But it was just so profound for me that was just another experience of I need to share this. I want to spread the message of breathwork and what it can do. But there's also a big somatic piece, I think, obviously, with breathwork. And for me, this was a big one. Like, you can drop out of your head and into your body and become aware of your body for the first time, sometimes in a very long time. And that's something that still happens for me. If I do a self-facilitated transformational breath session, sometimes I get a real slap in the face from my body in regards to like, listen up. This is the tension that you're holding in your neck and your shoulders and things like this. So I think it's a beautiful practice for everyone to cultivate. It doesn't have to be conscious connected breath work initially. And in fact, I think there's a growing movement, which is conscious connected breath work can be re-traumatizing. It can be dysregulating for some people, dependent on the state of their nervous system and their journey to that point. So sometimes we have to start with the coherent breathing. Let's say 5-second inhale, 5-second exhale through the nose, doing that for 20 minutes a day to actually establish a bit of regulation within the nervous system. So where the type of breath work needed is going to be different for each individual ultimately. But obviously, I guess Wim Hof is the breath work that's kind of really shown and been studied in regards to like immune responses, for example.
Yeah.
So transformational breath, I don't think has any studies like that behind it. Wim Hof has done an amazing job of, I guess, driving that a little bit more. And we know that there are people that do these practices and have a really positive impact on how their immune system is responding to pathogens. So one of the studies, and what you see also, what just came to mind, what we also see, I guess, just in the literature, ultimately, this concept of immune resilience, which is someone with a resilient immune system can have a less inflammatory response to stimuli that do trigger an inflammatory response. So they've kind of got like a more regulated, better modulated immune system. And a lot of people might be familiar with that Wim Hof study that I think the takeaway ultimately was these people were taught the Wim Hof methods, exposed to the endotoxin of, I think it was E. coli, so a bacteria that has something on its surface called LPS, lipopolysaccharides, which is a very immune stimulating inflammatory molecule, if that's the right words. They were given that basically after practicing, and there was a control, and those practicing Wim Hof had a less potent immune response to the endotoxin, and therefore didn't have the symptoms that you would associate with being exposed to this endotoxin, which would be flu-like symptoms, basically. So they were able to mount a more, let's call it, appropriate response, because it's not the bug, it's not the endotoxin that's going to trigger symptoms. In any case, it is the immune response and how your immune system is relating to it that is going to trigger the symptoms. So this is one of the reasons why this concept of immune resilience is so important and powerful, because actually you're influencing how your immune system is interacting with these toxins. So breathwork has multiple mechanisms and benefits. The immune system, there was the case study we talked about from a gut perspective, nervous system regulation. That's where arguably most of the research has been done, at least from my perspective. And then, it's just a beautiful tool that is so easy that you can do in informal practices when you're doing the dishes, through to, your conscious, connected, holotropic style breathworks as well.
Absolutely. And, even the kind of mystical and spiritual experiences we can have, kind of like what you shared there. My first introduction to breathwork was holotropic. 10 years ago, I had no idea what I was getting myself in for. Oh, a breathwork retreat. Yeah, I'm up for it. And, it was one of those moments. The ceremony was one of the most profound, shifts and changes for me in terms of, the body holding trauma, these kind of altered states of consciousness. And that really catapulted me into all the work of Stan Groff, and his link into the psychedelic realms as well. I just finished a course by James Nestor, and I feel like he really articulates it all really well. He's covered a lot of these different breath works, but it's interesting that you kind of touch on that point that and I feel like this is very true with the work in psychedelics too, which we can shift into in a few minutes. That, not everybody needs these big cathartic experiences, because their nervous system, their background of trauma, their history of, not being able to regulate their emotions, their themselves, it's just not needed. So, I always advise people now, start off slow with breath work, do the box breath, do some, nasal breathing. I love the work of Patrick McKeown. I'm actually doing his Oxygen Advantage at the moment. I have a big crush on his work, because he really blends in the science too,
Yeah.
And he comes at it from a very functional, kind of scientific, academic perspective. But yeah, then, I love some of the other breath workers out there, exploring just the transformational aspect and the altered states of consciousness aspect. There's just so much in it, really, isn't there?
There is. I'm mindful that a lot of people I follow, or the big three I follow on in like Instagram, they are doing an amazing job of kind of sharing the science with breathwork, which is really important, super interesting. But I'm also really passionate in, the other sides to certainly conscious connected breathwork. And I think of some of the feedback I got from clients, quite a common one. It's happened with a few men that have come and had some one-to-one breathwork whereby they've actually connected in the session with their dad. And it's led them to go and visit their dad and have, a conversation that needs to be had, or a more authentic conversation. And, I don't know, we don't really need the science from that perspective. There's something, I'm going to say, deeper than that can go on within these sessions that can be profoundly life-changing. And there's no explanation for it. It was just what came up for them in that session. And it's just beautiful.
Absolutely. On the men's work retreats that I run in Ireland, we always do breath work. And, some of the men have never done any psychedelics or any of that kind of thing. And, they have these, incredible experiences of like, maybe meeting their father who passed away, or seeing themselves as their inner child. I think it's a really great practice in men's work.
Yeah, and in group in particular, like I think, some of that therapy is in being seen and being heard. So I just love it. I love the energy. I love being in that sort of energy and in that environment, because it's so deeply lacking in the modern world, and it's so deeply healing at the same time. So yeah.
And yeah, kind of segueing then into the world of psychedelics. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about, this has kind of been a journey the last couple of years. You went to a psychedelic retreat in the Netherlands. What did that kind of catalyze for you? And it sounds like, similar to me, that kind of classic take psychedelics and you're like, I want to know everything about them. And now I want to work in the space. And I really feel like this is a key or a tool or a great transformational kind of medicine for people. And, I love that so many people who have psychedelic experiences then want to get involved in the space and kind of champion it as maybe the way forward. So I'd love to hear what's been your journey.
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a bumpy road, as I guess can often be the case. Like it just opens up parts of you, or certainly open up parts of me that I wasn't really aware of. And I think in some ways it was a little bit destabilizing because it's hard to know what to do with some of the stuff that can come up in ceremony. And I guess what I mean by that is, just my world, I guess, expanded after my first psychedelic experience. And I became more aware of parts of myself that I had neglected, for example, and trying to integrate those parts back into day-to-day life can be hard unless you've got the supports. And I think one of the concerns I have with psychedelics is the fact that a lot of us can go onto these retreats, but unless we've got the infrastructure in place when we come back, it can be really hard. Like, who do you talk to, etc. So I'm always mindful of, like, when people are asking me these days, I kind of almost focus more on the concerns I have to make sure they're thinking, about the preparation and the integration phases of it, rather than just kind of the retreat and the facilitators that they might be thinking about. But yeah, for me, post-retreat, I think I was still in ceremony when I was like, I need to train it. I need to give this to my clients kind of thing. So I came back, I was just, a little bit obsessed to begin with. I was looking into like changing career. I was like, I'm going to become a psychotherapist and I'm going to bring this in from that perspective. And I just slowly started, I think, to realize that what I really want is to find a way to sit in the middle of the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and to integrate all of these different practices and ways of knowing into one sort of process, container, whatever it may be. So I think my vision is to always be working with clients who are struggling with chronic, complex health issues, but utilizing functional medicine, nutritional therapy, physical exercise, and breathwork and psychedelics to support them to the best health that they're going to be able to achieve. So, go on a truly transformational sort of journey with them and bring them together in ceremony. Ultimately, that's like the long-term vision. Because I do just think that they have such a powerful role to play from a physical health perspective. And I'm not as interested, they're anti-inflammatory and they're antimicrobial and they're also, psychoplastogens, I think is a term that is sometimes used. So they influence the neuroplasticity in the brain, obviously. But more just like the deep, mythic, metaphorical stuff that takes place that is, where the magic happens, I think, ultimately. So just, holding that space and allowing people to go there and have those experiences. During the synthesis training, there's one moment that really stands out during the low dose ceremony that we had, whereby, there was just this profound sense of deep safety and belonging. And I remember, just bursting into tears afterwards when we were kind of sharing our experiences and just wishing everyone could have that experience of just safety and belonging. Like, you're safe, you belong here, you can rest. Like, something that I think a lot of us lack without actually knowing we lack it. Because we're just so busy, we're so stressed, we've all got concerns from all different areas of life these days. So even on that sort of somewhat basic level, it's just such a beautiful thing to be able to bring people together and have those sorts of experiences. And if there's a theme around healing anyway, because people are dealing with whatever it may be, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, etc. That's the dream, I think, ultimately.
Yeah, well, it's so beautiful. And, I've experienced that in so many of the spaces I get to grace on a very regular basis. I think, the term that was coined is a communitas,
Yes. Yeah.
people having this sense of belonging and being seen and safety. And I think that's one of the biggest malaises of the Western society is this lack of community. We're all trying to be out there individually healing ourselves. And, when we come back into the circle and meet practitioners like yourself and have guidance and support and mentorship, that's when it can really, get someone from A to B,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. Like there is such a hyper focus on the individual, and we're kind of it's part of culture. We're being conditioned to think that way, I think, ultimately, and it's something I've really been sitting with recently, having just done 2 webinars, one on family resilience and one on relationship resilience, and this idea that resilience is in our relationships. And someone shared a statistic the other day, which is, I can't remember what the percentage is, but I'm going to say about 50%. 50% of young Americans don't feel they have one best friend. So, there are some really scary statistics around loneliness and friendships and how this is all lacking. And to the point that in nutritional therapy and functional medicine, we're working with an individual. But, if I look back over the years, how many conversations have I had with those clients around how they're going to work in the family unit when they're in their healing process and might be eating a certain way when everyone else is eating a different way. And like, we don't even really go there or taught how to go there ultimately. But as you say, it's a prerequisite. It's a foundational piece of the healing process.
Yeah, it's kind of like this family systemic change. If one person goes out and does a lot of work and then goes back into like a non-conducive healing environment, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to, keep that kind of energy and openness and embody and integrate that kind of, wisdoms or shift in perspective or new beliefs. And, you kind of said it there at the start. It's really, really important to make sure you have that kind of support structure after working with psychedelics, and even maybe having a big breathwork experience. I really feel like, a lot of people who take a big psychedelic or have a big psychedelic experience, the real ceremony is when they leave, when life is the ceremony, as I hear so much in the space. And then it's really around, integrating, embodying the wisdom, creating a really, good day to day, and whatever that looks like for you, might be different from the next person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's it. Life is the ceremony, and a big lesson I've learned, I think, from it is it's the little things that feel like big lessons, but it's the little things that are sacred, like taking the trash out. Like that can be a sacred act. And all these little things that actually go, I can change how I'm relating to these behaviors, these habits, these routines. And that is sometimes a lifelong lesson. At least I find I'm constantly having to remind myself of these things.
Totally. It's kind of like the, chop wood, carry water, become enlightened, chop wood, carry water, or, doing the laundry. I think, I've heard that one as well.
Yeah.
Big fan of Thich Nhat Hanh as well. Wash the dishes to wash the dishes, and know that you're washing the dishes to wash the dishes. Alex, it's been so wonderful to have you on. So knowledgeable, so full of resources. I think people are going to get a lot from this episode. So where can people hear about your work if they want to get in touch with some of your workshops on resilience or, personalized integrative medicine? Let us know.
Yeah. So my website is just alexmanos.co.uk, and you'll find kind of links to everything on there. And Instagram is kind of the social media platform that I most use, and my kind of handle is just Alexander Manos. So those, are the 2 best places to find me.
Wonderful. Anything you'd like to say out to the world before we finish? Any wisdom?
Thank you for listening. If you've made it this far.
Yeah, always, isn't it?
It's been a pleasure to be on. Thanks, Dara, for inviting me. We're going to have to flip the the roles, and we'll have to get you on our podcast as well and continue the conversation. But no, I just hope people have found it helpful, and maybe it's given people one or two additional things to look into. But yeah, do reach out if you've got any questions or thoughts. I'm always ears and open.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for your presence, for the work you've done yourself, for the work you share to the world. It's deeply appreciated. And yeah, I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person soon.
Definitely. Thank you, Dara.